welcome to Silent Screams. You know, when we think about schools, it's usually the last place you'd expect to find anything remotely terrifying, right? It's where we learn, where we grow up, where we feel safe. But sometimes, things happen. Things that make us question that safety. Lockdown drills are meant to prepare us for the worst, but what happens when those drills aren't drills? When the thing you're supposed to be hiding from isn't a shooter, but something far darker? This story I'm about to tell you, it's one of those. So, sit back, keep the lights on, and remember, some doors are locked for a reason. It all started on a Thursday. The kind of day where everything feels routine, boring even. First period had dragged on forever, and by lunch, I was just counting down the hours until I could get out of there. The bell rang, and I was finally free to escape into the cafeteria chaos. But something was off. You ever get that feeling? Like something's just wrong? I couldn't shake it. I sat with my usual group of friends, but I wasn't really paying attention to their conversations. It's like the air felt heavy, like the kind of humidity that clings to you on a hot day, only this wasn't about the weather. It was that sort of stillness that makes the hair on the back of your neck stand up. I wasn't alone in noticing it. I saw a few teachers glancing around nervously, whispering to each other in hushed voices. Then, mid-bite into my sandwich, the intercom crackled to life. Attention students, this is a lockdown. This is not a drill. Please proceed to the nearest classroom and follow all protocols immediately. The cafeteria went dead silent. For a moment, no one moved, no one breathed. And then chaos. Chairs scraped, people shoved, everyone scrambling to find a room, a place to hide. It was as if every instinct in our bodies told us we weren't safe, no matter where we were. I rushed down the hall with a few others, our footsteps echoing too loudly against the linoleum floors. I ducked into the nearest classroom, the door slamming shut behind me with a sound that made my heart race even faster. Inside, about 10 other students had gathered, all of us jittery and exchanging confused, scared looks. Our teacher, Mrs. Daniels, was pale, her hands shaking as she locked the door and pulled down the blinds. "This will pass," she muttered more to herself than to us. Just a precaution. The room felt suffocating. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears as we crouched down by the desks, the lights off, the room plunged into an unnatural silence. Minutes dragged on, each one longer than the last. The only sound was the faint hum of the school's ventilation system. And then, without warning, it stopped. The humming, the whirring of the fans, it all cut off, leaving us in an almost unbearable silence. "Is that supposed to happen?" whispered Jenna, one of the girls beside me. Her voice wavered, but before anyone could answer, we heard it. Footsteps. Not the kind you hear every day. These weren't the heavy, deliberate steps of a teacher or even a security guard. They were lighter, almost hesitant, but too slow to be normal. Step, step, pause. Each one echoed down the hall, growing closer. Mrs. Daniels held a finger to her lips, her eyes wide with fear, as if silently begging us to stay quiet. But those footsteps kept getting closer, and they weren't alone. There was another sound now, a soft scratching. Like nails against the floor, or worse, like claws. It sent a shiver through my entire body. What the hell was out there? Suddenly, the doorknob rattled. Every muscle in my body tensed as we all stared at that door, praying it wouldn't open. The rattling stopped, but then came a whisper. Faint, almost indistinguishable. It was a voice. A child's voice. "Let me in." No one moved. My throat was dry, my mind screaming at me to run, but there was nowhere to go. Then, the voice came again, louder this time. More insistent. "Let me in." The voice was wrong. It was too thin, too stretched, like someone was trying to mimic a child but didn't quite know how. My skin crawled as I heard Jenna next to me let out a whimper. I think it's my sister," she whispered, her eyes wide with confusion and terror. "She's in kindergarten. I need to check." "Don't," Mrs. Daniels hissed, grabbing Jenna's arm just as she started to stand. "That's not your sister. Whatever it is, it's not her." Jenna's eyes darted between Mrs. Daniels and the door, her face pale and tear-streaked. "But she's safe," Mrs. Daniels interrupted, though the certainty in her voice was shaky at best. "She's safe in her own classroom. Do not open that door." The voice outside the door turned into a low, guttural growl. The doorknob twisted violently as if whatever was out there had lost its patience. I pressed myself closer to the wall, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't help it. My eyes were drawn to the narrow window in the door. There was something there, just a shadow at first, but then a face appeared. It wasn't a face. Not really. It was wrong in every way. The eyes were too big, too dark, and the smile, it stretched impossibly wide, revealing sharp teeth that gleamed even in the darkness. It pressed its face against the glass, that eerie smile never faltering. "I can see you," it whispered, its voice slithering into the room like a cold breeze. "Let me in." Jenna sobbed, burying her face in her hands as the thing outside pressed harder against the door. Mrs. Daniels moved in front of us, shielding us as best as she could, but she was just as terrified. The air in the room grew colder, the kind of cold that seeps into your bones. I felt my fingers go numb, and my breath fogged in front of me. The scratching sound returned, louder this time, like nails on a chalkboard, setting my teeth on edge. It was coming from the walls now, circling us, surrounding us. And then, as quickly as it had begun, it stopped. The footsteps, the scratching, the whispers, all of it. Silence filled the room once again, but it wasn't a relief. It was worse. Much worse. Mrs. Daniels slowly backed away from the door, her eyes never leaving that small window. "It's gone," she whispered, but none of us moved. The silence stretched on, every second a lifetime. And just when I thought we might be safe, we heard it. A faint tapping. Not on the door this time, but on the window. The large, black windows on the far side of the room. Slowly, I turned to look, my heart pounding in my chest. There, standing outside the window, was the same figure. Its two-eyed smile gleaming, its hands pressed against the glass. It shouldn't have been possible. We were on the second floor. No one moved. No one dared breathe. And then, with a sickening crack, the glass splintered. It was coming in. The crack in the glass spread slowly at first, like a spider web unraveling in slow motion. None of us moved, frozen in place as the tension in the room tightened like a noose. Every breath felt loud, every heartbeat pounding in my ears. The thing outside the window pressed its face harder against the glass, its distorted smile growing wider as its sharp teeth gleamed under the faint light. It was watching us, waiting. I don't know what came over me, but I couldn't look away. My gaze was locked on the thing as the crack widened, the sharp sound of glass creaking filling the room. It wasn't just the sight of it that sent chills down my spine, it was the feeling, the overwhelming sense that it wasn't just a physical presence, but something much worse. It was like the air in the room had been replaced with pure, undiluted fear. Something dark, something ancient, something that had no right to be here. Jenna whimpered beside me, her nails digging into my arm as she trembled uncontrollably. Mrs. Daniels had backed away, her face pale, but her hands remained clenched in fists at her sides. Her eyes darted from the door to the window, and I could see the conflict in her expression. She wanted to protect us, but whatever was outside, whatever was about to come in, was beyond anything she could stop. The crack splintered again, louder this time. The figure outside cocked its head to one side, as if amused by our helplessness. I think we need to run," whispered Kyle, a kid from the back of the room. His voice was barely audible, but his words sent a shock through the group. He was right. Sitting there, waiting for whatever was coming, wasn't going to save us. We had to move, had to do something. But where could we go? Mrs. Daniels seemed to snap out of her trance. "Everyone, to the back door," she whispered urgently, motioning us toward the emergency exit that led to the back stairwell. The problem was, it was on the other side of the room, closer to the window. Closer to that thing. We scrambled to our feet, trying to stay as quiet as possible. The moment we moved, the figure outside seemed to react, pressing harder against the window, its smile fading as if it was growing impatient. The glass creaked louder, and small shards began to fall from the edges, scattering onto the floor with soft, ominous clicks. "Go, go," Mrs. Daniels urged in a harsh whisper. I grabbed Jenna's hand, pulling her along as we crept toward the exit. My eyes kept darting back to the window, to the growing cracks, expecting at any second for the glass to give way entirely. Just as we reached the door, the figure outside slammed its hand against the glass. The sound was deafening in the silence, and the entire pane shattered in an instant. We screamed. There was no controlling it now. Panic had taken over. The creature's hand reached through the broken window, long, twisted fingers clawing at the air as it tried to pull itself inside. Mrs. Daniels yanked open the emergency door, ushering us through with frantic gestures. "Run! Get to the stairs," she shouted. I didn't need to be told twice. We bolted down the narrow stairwell, our footsteps thundering in the enclosed space. Behind us, I could hear the sickening sound of the creature pulling itself through the broken window, its body making an unnatural, bone-cracking sound as it squeezed through the small opening. The thought of it crawling through, coming after us, made my skin crawl. We hit the bottom of the stairs and burst into another hallway, dimly lit by the emergency lights. The air down here felt different, heavier, colder. And then I noticed something odd. The hallway was long, too long. This part of the school wasn't supposed to be here. I had walked these halls hundreds of times, but this was wrong. The walls seemed to stretch further than they should, the lockers lining the sides old and rusted, like they'd been abandoned for decades. The fluorescent lights flickered above us, casting strange, moving shadows on the floor. It was as if we'd stepped into a different world entirely. Where are we?" Kyle asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," Mrs. Daniels replied, her voice betraying her own confusion. This isn't right. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in short, visible puffs, and a deep sense of dread settled over me. We weren't alone. I don't think we're in the school anymore, Jenna whispered, her eyes wide with terror. I wanted to tell her she was wrong, that we were just in a part of the school we didn't know well, but the truth was, I felt it too. This place wasn't the school. It was something else. And then, from the shadows at the end of the hall, we saw movement. At first, it was just a figure, indistinct, like a shadow of a person. But as it moved closer, the details began to take shape. It wasn't the thing from the window. This was something different. It was taller, its body cloaked in darkness, but its eyes, they glowed a sickly yellow in the dim light, piercing through the shadows like beams from some hellish lighthouse. We froze. It stopped just a few feet away from us, its gaze fixed on our group. No one moved, no one breathed. The silence stretched on, oppressive, as the thing simply stood there, watching us. Waiting. Then it spoke. You shouldn't be here. The voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't human. It wasn't even close. It was layered, like multiple voices speaking at once, each one twisted, distorted, like the echoes of a nightmare. We didn't mean to, Mrs. Daniels began, but the creature cut her off. You have trespassed into a place where the living do not belong. You have broken the veil. Jenna whimpered, clutching my arms so tightly it hurt. I didn't blame her. My legs felt like jelly, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. What do you want from us? Mrs. Daniels asked, her voice shaking. The creature's yellow eyes blinked slowly, its head tilting to the side. It is not what I want. It is what they want. They? Kyle whispered. From the darkness behind the creature, more figures began to emerge. Dozens of them. They looked like people, but there was something wrong with them. Their eyes were hollow, their skin pale and stretched tight over their bones. They moved slowly, jerky, like marionettes on strings, their heads twitching unnaturally. And they were all coming toward us. We need to run, I said, my voice barely audible. But there was nowhere to run to. The hallway stretched on forever, and the way we had come was swallowed by the shadows. Mrs. Daniels stepped forward, standing between us and the advancing figures. Go, she said, her voice firm. I'll hold them off. No, Jenna cried. You can't go. Mrs. Daniels shouted, turning to face the creatures with a determination that I hadn't seen before. I'll keep them back as long as I can. I didn't want to leave her. None of us did. But the figures were closing in fast, and we didn't have a choice. We turned and ran. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, the lockers blurring past us as we sprinted, our lungs burning with the effort. Behind us, I could hear the sounds of struggle, Mrs. Daniels shouting something, but I didn't dare look back. We ran until we couldn't anymore, until the hallway finally ended in a single door. A door that shouldn't have been there. It was old, wooden, and carved with strange symbols that I couldn't understand. What is this? Kyle gasped, leaning against the wall, trying to catch his breath. It's our only way out, I said, pushing the door open. We stumbled through, and the moment we did, everything changed. The air was warm again. The hallways were back to normal, clean, bright, filled with the distant sounds of other students. We were back. I looked around, my heart still racing, my mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. Jenna was shaking, her face pale, but we were alive. We were safe. But Mrs. Daniels, she hadn't come with us. The door we had come through was gone, replaced by a blank wall. There was no sign of the strange hallway, no sign of the creatures. It was as if it had never existed. But it had. We knew it had. "Where's Mrs. Daniels?" Kyle asked, his voice trembling. I didn't have an answer. None of us did. We stood there in silence, the weight of what had just happened pressing down on us. The school was alive with the sounds of normal life again, but nothing would ever be normal for us. We had seen something we weren't meant to see. We had crossed into a place we never should have gone. And we had left something behind. Or maybe something had followed us back. As we walked down the hall, I could have sworn I felt a pair of eyes watching us. But when I turned to look, there was nothing there. Nothing except the faint sound of footsteps,